Arthur Szyk was born in 1894 in Łódź, in an area of Poland which at that time was under Russian rule. His family were Jewish and his father was the director of a textile factory in the town, but tragically in 1905, during a period of insurrection, a rioting factory worker threw acid in his face and he was permanently blinded. In 1909, when he was only 16 years old, Szyk travelled to Paris to study at the Académie Julian. Following his studies, he returned to Poland and began creating political cartoons, while simultaneously continuing his studies at the Jan Matejko Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow. In 1914, he was conscripted into the Russian army to fight against Germany, but in 1916, with war still raging, he married Julia Leickerman, and a year later she gave birth to a son. Poland regained its independence at the end of the war in 1918, and in 1919 he created a series of pen and ink cartoons for a satire aimed at all things Germanic by the writer Julian Tuwim. But in the same year Szyk fought again, this time as a Polish cavalry officer, in the mercifully brief war with Russia, which ended with a Polish victory in 1920. In 1921 he and his family relocated to Paris, and it was there that he began to enjoy his first significant success as an illustrator. In 1925 his illustrations for the Book of Esther from the Hebrew Bible were published, featuring the incredibly detailed colour application and fine graphic ornamentation, all created with the use of gouache paint, which would make his reputation. A year later it was followed by his illustrated edition of Gustave Flaubert's The Temptation of Saint Anthony, which also featured meticulously applied gouache and deliberately medievally structured and formally composed scenes. Pierre Benoit's novel Jacob's Well was published in 1927, and this time, although every bit as mannered as his other illustrations, Szyk's images were suitably contemporary in their subject matter. The only stylistic exception to this painted approach came with the two-volume edition of anecdotal humour titled The Laughing Jew, published at the same time. These books were a return to his much earlier pen and ink style, with a series of throwaway spot illustrations dotted throughout to accompany the humorous text. During the second half of the 1920s, he was also involved in the creation of a series of images which commemorated the statutes of Kalisz, a charter of liberties granted to the Jews by the Duke of Kalisz in 1264. It was eventually published as a book in 1932, but it had gained earlier popularity when some of the images had been published as a set of postcards in Poland in the later 1920s. In 1930 he began another sizable historical project, this time on the subject of George Washington and the American Revolutionary War. The series of around 40 precisely rendered watercolours was presented at an exhibition at the Library of Congress a few years later, where it attracted a large number of visitors. When Hitler's National Socialist Party came to power in Germany in 1933, Arthur Szyk began what would be a remarkably long and visually eloquent series of condemnations of the man and his ideology. He created many drawings and paintings of increasing visual sophistication and acute political observation, which sent out clear warning signals about where this regime was heading. Unfortunately, very few were listening, and most ignored the obvious growing threat. His anti-Nazi images aside, at this time Szyk was primarily occupied with creating a major series illustrating the Haggadah, the account of the Jewish exodus from ancient Egypt. The series comprised 48 miniature paintings produced between 1934 and 1936, but in 1937, when he travelled to London where the book was to be printed and published, he was forced to remove some of his more overt anti-German references by the publishers, who were by this point reluctant to provoke the increasingly belligerent Hitler. It's hard to imagine how he had found the time to create it, but at the 1939 New York World's Fair, the Polish pavilion prominently featured Szyk's 23 remarkably detailed paintings depicting the contribution of the Poles to the history of the United States, one of the greatest works of civic art created in this period. The Haggadah was finally published in 1940, by which time Poland had already been invaded by Germany. And according to the art critic at the Times newspaper, it was worthy to be placed among the most beautiful of books that the hand of man has ever produced. And he was probably right, but it was also the most expensive new book in the world at the time, with each of the 250 limited edition copies of vellum selling for what would now be just shy of £8,000 or $10,000. Now that Szyk's dire warnings about the Nazis had proven painfully accurate, he redoubled his efforts as a propagandist for the Allies, with a series of painted cartoons which reflected his immense disdain for the Führer and his associates Goering, Goebbels, and the Italian dictator Mussolini. And following the Haggadah's publication, Szyk left Britain for the USA with the express mission of bringing Americans on side with the Allies' struggle against the Nazis. In that year, the American publisher George Macy of the highly respected Heritage Press asked him to illustrate the Persian book The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Szyk obliged, and the results were another major creative triumph, which again made great use of intricate, delicately visualized borders around the actual narrative content of the illustrations. Every one of the page illustrations created constituted a highly absorbing blend of technical accomplishment and aesthetic balance. Once more, I can only marvel at his prolific output, but in his capacity as an envoy for the Allies in 1941, he also published his book of satirical drawings of Hitler and his associates titled The New Order, which was successful in whipping up greater support from the USA. But it was Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor in that year which brought the USA into the war, and Szyk now had a new target for his merciless mockery in the form of Emperor Hirohito and his military leaders. As both a Jew and a Pole, Szyk's hatred of the Axis powers was more than understandable, but he never allowed his emotions to get the better of him, and his satirical potshots were always clear-headed and metaphorically accurate. Not long after his arrival in the USA, Szyk was inspired by a speech made by President Roosevelt to create a quartet of powerful stylized images illustrating each of the 4 freedoms of humanity, and these images were very well received. His satires of the enemy appeared frequently in newspapers and magazines, including Time, Esquire, and Collier's, and they also featured regularly on propaganda posters for the military and civilians, including some highly amusing cautionary posters for American troops about venereal disease. Szyk did not avoid topics which presented the Allies in a less favourable light, and in a controversial drawing from 1944, a group of debating Polish politicians are shown as opponents of Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill. He also created imagery around this time expressing solidarity with Russia, despite their earlier historical transgressions against his homeland. Despite the war entering its 6th year in 1945, he also illustrated a new edition of the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This book contains some relatively simple pen and ink monochromes, but as usual it was his colour-painted work which defined the book and made it so very successful. These fantasy illustrations were painted with his expected eye for detail, and they undoubtedly form one of the most vivid and imaginative visualizations of Andersen's stories ever created. Following the end of the war in 1945, Arthur Szyk and his family moved from New York City to New Canaan, Connecticut, and a year later the Heritage Press published a large collection of paintings and drawings from the years of the war, memorably titled Ink and Blood. Szyk continued to be astonishingly prolific in the post-war years, even though his satirical work was no longer required now that peace of a sort had been restored. In 1946, his illustrated edition of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was published, although rather than deal with the actual tales told by the various characters, he concentrated on creating studies of the characters themselves, which would not look out of place as designs for some medievalist computer game. But in the same year, 2 more books were published, Pathways Through the Bible, written by Mortimer J. Cohen, and the Book of Job. This constituted a return to biblically themed projects, and in the following year he published another two, the Book of Ruth and the Ten Commandments, which, to be strictly accurate, was more a series of decorated panels, each evoking a particular sin. Arthur Szyk was granted American citizenship in 1948, and in the same year was delighted that the Israeli Declaration of Independence was announced, and he celebrated this event with the publication of his richly decorated illumination of the document. There was more religious work in 1949 with an illustrated story of Joseph and his brothers, and 2 years later, on July 4, 1950, he also exhibited another illuminated text of the United States Declaration of Independence. He continued to be politically active and publicly criticised the McCarthyism rampant in 1950s America and the inherent racism of some elements of American society. Like other outspoken artists of his era, he was accused by the House Un-American Activities Committee of belonging to communist organisations. Szyk and his son George vehemently denied any such leanings, but it became a moot point when not much later in 1951 Arthur Szyk died of a heart attack at the age of only 57. In the decades following his death, a couple of his books were reprinted and published again, but even so he became increasingly forgotten in the USA. But in 1991, the Arthur Szyk Society was established in Orange County, California. The founder of the society, George Gooch, rediscovered Szyk's work and staged an exhibition in Los Angeles. The success of this led to a considerable upturn in interest about Szyk and his remarkable body of work. Gooch did the world an immense service by reviving awareness and appreciation of the man and his achievements. And although still far from a household name, Arthur Szyk's memory is likely to endure and hopefully delight future generations with his decorative prowess, articulate satire and narrative abilities.